Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever interacted with India's massive IT sector, or maybe you've just marveled at its rapid global economic rise, it all traces back to one incredibly dramatic paradigm shift. Today, we're unpacking the landmark economic reforms of 1991. This was the defining moment when India completely shifted gears from a heavily state-controlled system to an open, market-driven economy. Let's dive right in. To really understand how big of a deal this was, we first have to plunge into the terrifying crisis of late 1990. The stakes here weren't just about sluggish growth, it was about absolute national survival. Imagine running a massive, incredibly populous nation and suddenly realizing you've essentially run out of the cash needed to keep the country functioning. That was India's grim reality. Just 14 days. What's really shocking about this number is that India's foreign exchange reserves had plummeted so incredibly low, they could only cover essential imports for exactly 2 weeks. We are talking about barely having enough money to buy petroleum to keep transport moving, or the essential goods required to just keep the economy breathing. Now, this wasn't an overnight disaster. It was more of a ticking time bomb built over a decade of profligate government spending and a really rigid economic model in the 1980s. Ultimately, it was detonated by the Gulf War oil shock in 1990, which basically doubled their import bill. Imports were growing at a staggering rate. Exports were completely stagnating, and inflation was skyrocketing. India found itself quite literally on the brink of a sovereign default, and no one wanted to lend them a dime. So, how are we going to break all this down? First, we'll look at the 1991 economic crisis itself. Then, we'll explore the big 3 pillars of the solution: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Finally, we'll wrap up by assessing the actual, objective impact of these reforms. Let's start with part 1, the 1991 economic crisis, which was, quite frankly, survival mode. To avoid total bankruptcy, India managed to secure a desperate $7 billion emergency bailout from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But, as you can probably guess, a lifeline like that doesn't come for free. It came with strict, non-negotiable conditionalities. The IMF and World Bank essentially said, look, we'll save you, but you have to fundamentally change the way you run your entire economy. And those strict conditions forced the creation of what became known as the new economic policy. Think of this as a massive 2-pronged attack. First up, you had short-term stabilization measures to just immediately control inflation and build back up those foreign exchange reserves. And second, you had long-term structural reforms aimed at improving the overall efficiency and competitiveness of the economy. All right, moving to part 2, liberalization, ending the Raj. In simple terms, liberalization was all about grabbing a giant pair of scissors and cutting through the suffocating red tape that had choked domestic growth since 1947. Before 1991, India operated under what was notoriously known as the License Raj. It was this highly complicated, bureaucratic maze where you literally needed government permission just to start a business, to expand it, or even to decide how many products you were going to manufacture. And wow, did they cut deep? The industrial licensing requirement was abolished for almost everything overnight. Only a handful of strategic categories, like aerospace and hazardous chemicals, were kept under restriction. They scrapped the rigid limits on large firms expanding. And crucially, they completely shifted the role of the Reserve Bank of India. Instead of being a strict regulator that controlled absolutely everything, it became a facilitator that actually let the market breathe. Which brings us to part 3, privatization, redefining the state. So having removed all those rules, the government then decided to step back from trying to run everything themselves. For decades, the public sector was expected to be the main driver of growth, but it had morphed into a massive fiscal burden. So they opted to start selling off minority stakes in public sector undertakings. This process, known as disinvestment, was meant to inject better management efficiency and, of course, reduce that crushing government debt. Now, people mix these two up all the time, so here's the really crucial distinction to remember. Liberalization is about lifting the rules and allowing players to compete. Privatization, on the other hand, is about changing the actual ownership structure of a company, shifting it from government hands to private individuals or entities. Okay, next up is part 4, globalization, opening the borders. With the domestic house finally getting in order, this was the moment India decided to tear down the massive protectionist walls it had built around itself.
Globalization was all about allowing foreign technology, investment, and goods to flow smoothly into the country, while simultaneously empowering Indian exports to flow out and actually compete on the world stage.
To kickstart this, they made a bold move and immediately devalued the rupee against foreign currencies. This made Indian exports significantly cheaper and way more attractive globally. They flung the doors wide open to foreign direct investment, allowing foreign banks and corporations to set up shop. And importantly, they laid the groundwork for the massive IT and outsourcing boom that India is so famous for today. So, all these massive changes lead us to Part 5, assessing the reform's impact. Time for the scorecard. If we look at this purely from a macroeconomic perspective, it was a massive success. The reforms literally catapulted India from a respectable 5.6% growth rate right up to a staggering 8.2% in the late 2000s. Foreign exchange reserves ballooned, foreign direct investment absolutely poured in, and it was all largely driven by an explosive surge in the service sector. But when we look a little closer at the specific sectors, a pretty stark divide emerges. Sure, IT, telecommunications, and civil aviation absolutely skyrocketed thanks to deregulation. But crucial areas like agriculture, the informal sector, and small businesses actually stagnated. In fact, public investment in agriculture practically dried up during this massive boom period. The data objectively shows us that while the first generation of reforms definitively rescued the Indian economy from bankruptcy and spurred incredible wealth, the results were heavily skewed. The benefits accrued largely to the urban formal sectors. It wasn't really inclusive, leaving millions in the rural and informal economy behind, which naturally sparked serious debates about the need for a new era of inclusive economic reforms. This idea is perfectly captured by a thought from former President K.R. Narayanan. He noted that huge GDP numbers are fantastic, and saving a country from sovereign default is a monumental achievement, for sure. But those numbers alone? They don't tell the whole story of a society's actual lived progress. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to consider today. As India continues its phenomenal rise as a global economic powerhouse, how can it actually balance that ferocious market growth with the survival and prosperity of its most vulnerable sectors? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the data.